It's my first interview actually in this new apartment, so
Hey, I feel special.
so okay, thank you very much indeed, Zahi, for the chance, the time, and your generosity to have this talk with you. I have a very introductory note about you and your past work, and then we start with the questions, comments, and exchange. So, Zahi Zalloua is a professor of philosophy and literature, professor of foreign languages and literature, French and interdisciplinary studies in Whitman College since 2003. He's written prolifically, but among his works are Mountain and the Ethics of Skepticism and Being Post-Human, another book actually, Ontologies of the Future, also Universal Politics, and the book that we're going to focus on today, Solidarity and the Palestinian Cause. So, Zahi, you wrote a book in 2017, if I'm not
Mm,
wrong, about Palestine, namely continental philosophy and the Palestinian question beyond the Jew and the Greek. And then you have this recent book. I mean, of course, not the mo. I mean, it's not published this year, but last year, um, about Palestinian solidarity and Palestinian cause. What is the
yeah.
reason and the meaning of this shift in your work?
Yeah, it is a subtle shift because I think you can ask the Palestinian question as a Palestinian cause. The Palestinian cause could be a response to the Palestinian question. So in the first book on Palestine, I wanted to situate the Palestinian question within the field of philosophy. So, right away, I had to juxtapose the Palestinian question with the Jewish question, which occupied the minds of many philosophers. And I was noticing a shift happening in philosophy. Etienne Bariba, Slavoj Žižek, Alain Badiou, Judith Butler were all starting to talk about Palestine and the Palestinian other. So I saw a shift within the field of philosophy to try to, in a sense, reckon with the other is other, as Edward Said put it about the Palestinian as a victim of the victim. So in that book, in the first book on continental philosophy and the Palestinian question, the subtitle Beyond the Jew and the Greek was my attempt to say, okay, in thinking the Palestinian question, can we avoid abstract universalism, which the Greek in a sense marked, and the figure of the Jew as an embodiment of particularity, right? The chosen people, in a sense of a difference. So beyond abstract universalism and a kind of tribalist vision of identity. So the arc of the first book really ends with Derrida, Said, Butler as theorists of difference. Since that book, I've become more critical of the absence of thinking universality. So I wrote a book on Zizek on race, which was an attempt to kind of articulate a universalist vision that is still grounded in the other, but not in a sense confined to the other. And the Palestinian became a kind of candidate for that concrete universal. Um, in the book, Solidarity in the Palestinian Cause, is still very much engaged in philosophy, but it looks at the response to the Palestinian question as a cause for solidarity, as a cause for movement. And in that book, there is a critical dialogue, both with indigenous studies and especially critical Black studies, and my engagement with Afro-pessimism and its critique of the human matters quite a bit into my conceptualization of what solidarity with Palestine looks like.
So, well, actually, I had the impression, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah,
I had the impression that this shift in the book is like the move from the question, I mean, from the question to the cause can
yeah.
also be seen in the in the question you posed in the beginning of the book, again, correct me, I mean, it's like my impression. I'm quoting you, addressing a new global anti-capitalist and
Yeah,
anti-imperialist left that avoids this separatist temptation,
yeah,
namely isolating tribal interests and fetishizing particularism and the elimination of difference. They claim that all subjugations are the same. I had the impression that it's also the goal of this new project.
absolutely. I mean, there's a more direct engagement with global capitalism, with class struggle. It is an attempt to think Palestine politically. So if continental philosophy and the Palestinian question operated almost under an ethical horizon, this book is far more committed explicitly to kind of political intervention. So what does it mean to have Black Palestinian solidarity? What does it open up? What could it potentially foreclose? How can we come up with a kind of vision of politics that addresses capitalism? So the Palestinian question, I think, would be much weakened if it ignores class struggle. And it says there's no real Palestinian question without engaging class struggle. And was, in a sense, my attempt to incorporate the Palestinian cause as a cause for justice, racial justice, economic justice, um, and resist identitarian lures, which has currency. In a sense, you want to advocate for identity, you can advocate for Palestinian identity, indigenous identity. So early in the book, I talk about this critique of indigenous reason, mirroring Membe's engagement with Black reason, critique de la raison nègre, and the way this vision of indigeneity can be very emancipatory. But its potential for emancipation is severely limited if it becomes a kind of rooted identity, a particularist manifestation. So linking it to class struggle is linking it to a kind of movement. So Palestine, Palestinians, Black Lives Matter activists occupy positions that Zizek describes as proletarian positions, right? And that they're excluded from the system. And if they're going to be included in the system itself would have to be radicalized, completely transformed. So that's my hope in that book, to try to articulate a Palestinian cause that speaks right, to the kind of monstrosity that is capitalism. Right, Membe again calls it becoming Black of the world. How do you situate Palestine in that reality?
Wonderful. Actually, one of the very interesting, let's say, delineations, elaborations in the book is this indigenous reason that you're addressing in the book. And there, in the beginning of the book, I mean, on the first pages, actually, you begin talking about Palestinian indigeneity.
Yeah,
What is that, Zahi? I mean, especially in
yeah,
relation to Israel's mythic
yeah,
nativity, sorry, and it is
yeah,
phantasmatic
yeah,
identity. What is
yeah,
this
yeah.
indigeneity of Palestine?
It's slippery. It's a slippery concept. So I describe a kind of historical indigeneity when it comes to Palestinians, and I describe a metaphysical indigeneity when it comes to kind of a Zionist discourse. And here I'm drawing from Said's distinction between beginnings and origins. Beginnings are historical, origins are divine, metaphysical, right? They're abstractions, which lends itself to mythical claims of continuity since antiquity. So in arguing for indigeneity, right, you confront an initial problem, that indigeneity is a creation of a settler, of a colonizer's vision, right? They're native, they're indigenous, we're cultured. And there, right, in the context of indigenous scholars, they're reclaiming the word indigeneity to stand not for some rooted identity or what is absent of culture, but an attempt to to evoke sovereignty, a sovereignty that is not individualistic, that is not murderous, but linked very much to the land. So to claim indigeneity in the context of Palestine is to bring in a settler colonial framework. And that settler colonial framework is crucial for understanding how indigeneity functions, because indigeneity points to an irreducible antagonism, the native and the settler, the occupied and the occupier. And that helps think Palestine through the discourse of indigeneity while pushing back against indigeneity's claim for rootedness. That's why in my engagement with Frank Wilderson, he has a paradigm of what he talks about redemption, that indigenous folks can always aspire to a time before the colonizer, prior to this contact with the colonizer. I personally think the Palestinian cause has to move beyond the past. So indigeneity here is not a return to a pre-colonial reality, but an engagement with global capitalism and thinking something radically new. So Said's vision of binationalism is precisely not a return to the past, but a way of thinking the possibility of coexistence with your Jewish neighbor, which, as you know, currently is very much in doubt.
Absolutely. I mean, talking about first, thanks for the beautiful answer. First, talking about Frank Wilderson's idea.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I mean, there are people who think of incommensurability of Black and
sure.
Palestinian cause. I
Yeah.
mean, police and IDF.
Mhm.
Uh, to what extent, Zahi, now, especially against the backdrop of the new situation in Gaza and in Palestine,
Yeah.
what such solidarity, I mean, why is such solidarity important? I mean, and also, is Black Palestinian solidarity in that sense possible? I mean, like theoretically, we
Yeah.
are speaking now.
Yeah. So maybe I can answer this question through a comment made by Jared Sexton, who's one of the leading theorists of Afro-pessimism. And he was involved in a roundtable over Black Palestinian solidarity, the possibility of such a solidarity. And he talks about the force of solidarity. What is in the struggle more than the struggle itself? And I find this observation extremely generative, insofar as Sexton is pointing that an emancipatory solidarity, in a sense, cannot be confined by the pleasure principle. What reinforces your identity, what actualizes your interests. In a sense, to be in solidarity is to risk acting against your own interests for the cause, for kind of a cause of justice. So when Wilderson complains about Palestinians, Ferguson is not Gaza, right? He's stressing there, Palestinians can have demands, they can be met, and they can leave Blacks behind. So he issues a challenge, and I think one has to take this challenge seriously. So whenever I discuss Palestine, I rarely use the language of dehumanization, because the human as such is in question for the Afro-pessimists, and for good reason. So a critique of Zionist techniques of demonization avoids the question of, okay, if we just recognize the humanity of Palestinians, everything would be okay. I want Palestine to be an occasion for us to revisit, right, the matrix of the human, how we imagine the human, who is included into the human, and how can we scrutinize its metaphysics to open up to the Afro-pessimist concern that the human, in a sense, is always predicated on not being a slave, and in the afterlife of slavery, of not being Black. So what does it mean to have the human here predicated on not being Black? And if Palestinians want to claim, right, the umbrella, they want to fall under the umbrella of humanity, because it would give you protections. You'll be seen as a human and not as a human animal. So whereas Wilderson says, okay, Palestinians have degraded humanity, Blacks have non-humanity. And I think that's a challenge. It's a challenge for any activist to say, okay, if I'm going to join the Black cause, if as a Palestinian activist, I want to join in the Black struggle, I'm not going to make my struggle contingent about what overlaps between the Black agenda and the Palestinian agenda. If you do that, then you're instrumentalizing the rage of Black activists and thinkers. I think that's deeply problematic. So as a Palestinian joining the Black cause, the movement for Black lives, in a sense, you open yourself to white terror and you accept this because of the cause. Conversely, if you're Black and you align yourself with Palestinian resistance, you risk, right, the original canceling label, anti-Semitism. You risk being called an anti-Semite if you join forces or express your solidarity in their struggle. So it was amazing how, after October 7th, you had this huge narrative about how murderous Palestinians are. Not just Hamas's attack, just Palestinian resistance as such was deemed anti-Semitic. You had numerous chapters from Black Lives Matter issue claims of solidarity. Palestinians are a family. You had the Red Nation issue a similar statement that we understand what does it mean to be colonized. And we align ourselves with that resistance. So here, these movements, these kind of activist movements, are risking being called anti-Semitic because they're siding with Palestinians. I think solidarity has to do that. Solidarity has to open you up to something that is against your personal interests. So that's why there's a kind of politics of the death drive in Black Palestinian solidarity that is worthy of its name. If it's confined only to what is good for you, it'll be a kind of transactional solidarity, which has proven very deficient in challenging the status quo. So one of the scenes I constantly return to is a kind of primal scene for Frank Wilderson, that he recounts in several places. This is his Palestinian friend who shares with him that experience of when he was in the West Bank, going through checkpoints and how humiliating those checkpoints were. And then he says, and his friend says, the worst experience is when the person who was doing the checking was an Ethiopian soldier. And there's kind of possibility for imagining what happens when you have the binary opposition, the native and the settler. So the native, the Palestinian, the indigenous population, the settler, the colonizer, the kind of Ashkenazi Jew, kind of white Jew, Jews that came from Europe. But you also have a kind of racial matrix in Israel. You have the Mizrahi Jews, the Arab Jews, who are second in terms of the kind of racial hierarchy. Then you have Ethiopian Jews who are thirds. And then you have Palestinians who are at the rock bottom. So Wilderson's vision of anti-Blackness has to be contextualized in Palestine. You can't just export the condition of Blacks in the United States and universalize that. There's a great danger in doing so. At the same time, you can ask, is the Ethiopian Jew in the same position absolutely as the white settler? No, I think it's a fair objections. So folks in indigenous studies, introduce an idea of the migrants, the non-sovereign, the person who ends up in Israel without really choosing Israel as its destination. But when the Ethiopian Jew, when the migrant is given a rifle and he's staring, he's putting it right in the face of the Palestinian, I think at that point he's closer to the settler than to the native. And that reality is never registered by Wilderson. he accounts for the anti-blackness of his Palestinian friend, which very much might be the case. But it doesn't exhaust the scene. Removing it from a settled colonial context, I think, skews it in a very limited fashion, narrows the intervention.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very interesting, very interesting part. I mean, also very interesting part of the book was actually devoted to this elaboration of Sexton's idea of solidarity. But based on that, Zahi,
Yeah,
we had the chance of talking about the Iranian uprisings. I mean, like the time we were talking that we had the last interview, it was like like it was juxtaposed to the uprising in Iran. But something that happens to me if I want to use what Sexton claims as
yeah,
the definition of solidarity, which is actually based on antagonism, is also based on, it's based on exceeding from within, as he calls it, I
sure.
think. Yeah, exceeding.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it
The
is for
death
me,
drive, right?
yeah, exactly. And it is for me based on an absolute political generosity. I mean,
Yeah,
this understanding of solidarity is based on generosity for me. If we take that as a criterion, I think that I have to, again, I mean, to my disappointment, I have to say that the Iranian uprising and the update of Iranian uprising and its reverberation convinces me to say that it fails in terms of solidarity. Like a lot of Iranian that's diaspora. At least let's talk
yeah,
about diaspora. I will more than visiting my family. I haven't been in Iran, but they failed in the sense that they couldn't actually implement the same sort of solidarity because of sticking to their own particularism, to their
sure,
own
sure,
identity. To
sure.
they wanted to, as you say, they wanted to export their own victimhood as a kind of the universal one, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
So for me, Palestine and Palestinian cause works also sometimes as a criterion to at least to measure how the other uprisings are going to be based on solidarity,
yeah.
or they function based on solidarity.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way you formulate this notion of generosity. Then in kind of a movement of solidarity, you're driven by the interests of the other, not primarily your interests. Your interests are still implicated, but they can be exhaustive of what solidarity looks like. So solidarity has to be constantly in friction with competing interests and ultimately, right, grounded in a certain ethical cause. And every single movement has to be measured in relationship to its ethical cause. So even you can take the Me Too movement. Um, when the Me Too movement became a manifestation of bourgeois women wanting their recognition of their suffering, it excluded, right, the framework of who's the most vulnerable. But what Mahanti kind of stresses, reading up the ladder of privilege, right? You start with those who are most exposed to uh, misogyny, exploitation, and then you work your way up. So this base should be, in a sense, the driving force of women in the Me Too movement. You start with those who are radically outside the norms of discourse, whose voice have been silenced. And the next move here is to engage these voices, not fetishize them, not elevate them as truth discourse. This is why I think in the book, I come back to um, Edward Said's kind of beautiful vision of solidarity. Um, Never solidarity without criticism, or never solidarity before criticism. So criticism is constitutive of solidarity rather than elevating the other, always in a sense the marginalized other, the racialized other. I think that kind of relationship doesn't doesn't help in the politics of those who've been excluded. one has to foreground an actual dialogue with the other and imagine futures rather than surrendering to the other because either they're white, they're bourgeois, or other facets. I think solidarity that is, again, worthy of its name has to have this built-in critique, internal critique.
If I can, I can shift the perspective to another question, which is actually my place, namely Germany, where I am living. There is a part in the book you're talking about. Somewhere in the book you say that I'm quoting you. At the same time, I'm quoting you. At the same time, in a global context marked by liberal democratic ideology, formulating Palestinian identity in terms of indigeneity tends to confine it to fix it at the level of culture. It effectively risks casting the Palestinian dilemma exclusively as a problem of cultural management. End of quote. Somewhere, I mean, you in this book you don't talk much about Badiou, but in the last book, like
Yeah.
Badiou is a figure there. He recognizes in the fourth spheres of truth. One of them is politics and its let's call pervert or caricature of politics, which is management. Um, uh, Sometimes you have this what is obvious to me, at least here in Germany, in relation to the question of Palestine or the cause, in my daily experience and exposure to media about the left party and the, let's say, liberal left German or green German,
Yeah.
which is ironically the least green party in the last decades, is in the process of is very obvious in the process these parties fusion with the state along their bureaucratization. Palestine question for them at best has been reduced to a management problem.
Sure.
From what I see in the best case scenario in Germany and through their liberal pragmatism, that's a cultural problem, that's an identity problem that has to be fixed. For me, the question is, how significantly do you view the weakness of the left in general, or the
Yeah.
liberal left in their alignment with the and the stance towards Palestine as
Sure.
reflective of what Badiou calls the predominance of management over
Yeah.
politics?
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a long
No.
question.
It's a wonderful evocation here, and part of, in the book, the gesture I make towards that kind of thinking is, the Afro-pessimist critique of Black leaders, in a sense, who are engaged in anger management. How do we manage Black anger? How do we make it respectable so white folks, white liberals can still support Black activism? So this kind of anger management fits nicely within a kind of cultural frame, cultural capture of indigeneity or other internally colonized subjects. So the way I would answer this question now, in this context, in the context of the Gaza war, indigeneity becomes relevant here if you want to give a face to Palestinians, but that face has to be the face of abjection. And since you have to imagine the Palestinians as starving, you don't really have to imagine that, you have to watch it. So this becomes a competing image to the Palestinian as bloodthirsty terrorists, right? The image of Hamas. So either Palestinians are radical embodiment of radical evil, or they're abject, right? Starving, dying, women and children constantly repeated as the kind of total passivity of Palestinians. And here Germany can flex its liberal muscles that no, this is unacceptable, children should not be starving. So this humanitarian reason governs and thrives under the umbrella of culture. And it's always interesting to look at Palestine and Ukraine. Western audiences generally have no difficulty entertaining Ukrainian suffering, right? Civilians being displaced, right? In a sense, they empathize with them, the stress is unacceptable, and they can imagine Ukrainian as freedom fighters with no contradictions. Ukrainians can be victims of devastation, and they can be freedom fighters. There's no such possibility for Palestinians. Either you're an abject victim or you're bloodthirsty terrorists, right? From kind of a Western powers, Euro-American framework. Activists are saying no. Activists want to see Palestinians as resisting. The question is, how do you resist, right? One can draw a distinction. Resistance that doesn't target civilians. But this is not the argument. The argument, either you accept a certain kind of status quo, right? In a sense, you don't show any violence towards Israel, because any violence towards Israel is an act of anti-Semitism. And in a sense, you accept your submission, your subjugation. You accept the occupation as a normal state of being. Okay, so you can say, well, all right, let's bracket armed struggle. BDS, non-violent, explicitly non-violent. No, that's equally anti-Semitic. So there are no ways for Palestinians to express their resistance that is not immediately labeled anti-Semitic. And I think the culture element here gives a small window for Palestinians, people feeling sorry for Palestinians, right? You have a lot of people who march, who are protesting, are horrified by seeing, body parts of children. But how do you move beyond this image of the victim? Because it could be very limiting. It can exert pressure on governments. But until we actually start seeing Palestinians as struggling for their existence, this will be repeated again and again, right? This is why kind of the indigenous framework always sends it back to settled colonialism. That framework is unavoidable. If you bracket the settled colonial system, then you have a distorted picture of reality, as if you have two equally competing powers over a territory dispute, where you have a conflict that can be resolved by international law. No, there's no conflict. There's an antagonism. There's a war that has to be, whose antagonism has to be clearly articulated. And this is the role of philosophy, to kind of articulate those antagonisms.
Absolutely, absolutely interesting. Zai, another person you're quoting in the book is the author Saidiya Hartman.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Hartman critiques a kind of identificatory impulse. I'm quoting from the book: "Only if I can see myself
Yeah.
in that position can I understand the crisis of that position." End of quote. But I continue what you wrote in the book: "Among white liberals, when it comes to the victims of anti-blackness, this happens. Such a phantasmatic, narcissistic identification becomes a precondition for white liberal outrage." Again, quoting, "That is the logic of the moral and political discourses we see every day. The need the need for the innocent black subject to be victimized by a racist state in order to see the racism of that racist state."
Yeah.
But to me, end of quote, to me, this is very much linked to the question of the value of life, or what Butler puts as grievability.
Yeah.
Namely, how many more innocent people, not only, to be honest, not only children and women, but also men, young men, how many of them should be killed to satisfy my need, namely the the grievability of them, actually, to consider them as life. I mean, that's not question. That's still something.
It's, I mean,
It's a tragic remark, on the situation.
So, October 6th what was happening to Palestinians October 6th. You had the occupation, you had the caging of Palestinians, you had the production, the sustainable reality that deprives Palestinians of any kind of life, symbolic life, right? In a sense, they're living in a condition of social death. So it took Hamas's attack for the world, for the global north, to pay attention to what is happening to Palestine. And the initial framing, Hamas fighters were beheading children. All this propaganda fueled a vision that Palestinians are to be eliminated, right? In a sense, everybody was using genocidal language. People thought, oh, initially metaphorically, but we see with the ICJ, this is not just metaphorical use of genocide. This is an actual enactment of genocide. So it is, the Western failure to confront Palestine, to accept the status of occupation as a normal state of affairs. And I mean, the sad part is that before October 7th, you had Netanyahu as the model to overcome, like Western liberals, Thomas Friedman, almost articulating a nostalgia for the two-state solution. Nostalgia for the two-state solution, which yielded nothing for 30 years. It didn't yield nothing, less than nothing. You had an increase in settlements, a shrinkage of Palestinian lands. So this inability to imagine a one-state solution that is grounded on equality and freedom for all, Said's vision, Butler's vision, Zizek's vision from a few years ago. There's a kind of return to this vision of a two-state solution as something that could help Palestinians, but the two-state solution, unless it reckons with international law, unless it calls for the right of return to be agreed upon, unless there is reparation, unless there is a radical rethinking of the way Zionists imagine their place on historic Palestine and their relationship to Palestinians, unless there's a radical decolonization of the mind and body of Israeli Jews, a two-state solution would be a disaster. So bringing in apartheid, bringing in settler colonialism are the frameworks for us to evaluate what does the world think this situation should look like. Are we going to hold Israel accountable for its blatant transgression of international law? I mean, if Iran sneezes the wrong way, you have sanctions automatically leveled against them. This kind of exceptionalism of Israel is deeply disturbing. And, United States is losing credibility every single day. They stood with Ukraine. Russia became a social pariah with good reason. What about Israel? For instance, shouldn't Israel be subject to the same logic that was applied to Russia? And until, in a sense, the world demands justice for Palestinians and to put these war criminals, Netanyahu and his war cabinet, behind bars, calling for a ceasefire is the least that can be done. These are war criminals, and we're treating them as leaders of a just state, of a liberal state, of a democratic state, of a Western-like state. And that's where, the outrage should be.
Absolutely. Again, some of these remarks are just really sharing some feelings that, I mean, for me, Zahi, there was a kind of new kind of uh, like new explorations of like on affective level sometimes that you see that okay, there are new forms of violence that you can explore recently. And one of the new forms of violence for me was that how numb people can be to the violence happening somewhere. Like it's a especially among the elites, especially among those educated minds. But that's why another part is also a remark, is not a question, is a comment that um, I'm quoting from the book. Visible among Zionist liberalism is a purported openness to the indigenous other, illustrates what is illustrated by Tak and Young, and they describe it as settler move to innocence.
Yeah.
Those strategies of positionings that attempt to relieve the settler of feelings of guilt or responsibility without giving up land or power or privilege, without having to change much at all. End of quote. I have the impression, be it liberal, be it woke Zionist, or any kind of liberal left, that innocence sometimes, especially after application of violence, after the violence is taken place, innocence is a capital that all of them try to own for
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
Soon
Yeah.
when things are under control,
Yeah.
everybody is looking for
Yeah.
innocence. I have a
Yeah.
quote from today, I think, in Guardian. Today or last night, I wrote it here. The European Union foreign policy chief says in Guardian, imagine the president was absolutely advocating what was happening in the beginning. He, in order to reclaim this capital, namely innocence, he says that, I'm quoting him, in Gaza, we are no longer on the brink of famine. We are in a state of famine, affecting thousands of people. I mean, this is unacceptable. This is the first person, one of the first person advocating what is happening there, and calling like what Hamas did absolutely as a kind of genocide, like raping children, yeah, beheading
Yeah.
them and everything. Yeah.
Mhm.
So there is a mechanism happening here that they want to own, also to claim their own innocence even after
Yeah.
violence. That's very
Absolutely.
interesting.
And the war cabinet made it clear they're shutting down Gaza. No food, no electricity. They're announcing they're going to starve the population. 2.3 million Palestinians. Oh, this is just a rhetorical flourish. You look at Israel's past, right? When they talk about mowing the lawn in Gaza, it's not, these metaphors are genocidal and they're acted upon. So this move to innocence that now Western powers want to claim that, okay, Israel has gone too far. And since they have to somehow please their constituencies, who are on the streets protesting against them, they want to be reelected. So they have to show some kind of acknowledgement that this is wrong. But where is the pressure? Where are the sanctions? Where is the embargo on Israel? Until you see that, it's merely rhetorical nonsense, which obfuscates the reality. In the book, I talk about this kind of two visions of the occupation on cruise control and the occupation on steroids. And, in the immediate term, right, the occupation on steroids, right, what one can call disaster occupation, what Israel in a sense is doing, taking Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism, they're taking full advantage of the Hamas attack to enact another Nakba. So this is the danger of occupation on steroids. But occupation on cruise control, you don't see, the world doesn't see the social violence, the state-sanctioned terrorism happening on Palestinians. People don't see it because it's not on television. It's not really being foregrounded in discussions of political matters. So for me, the larger problem, the bigger problem is liberal Zionism and liberals more generally. How they want change without change, right? To take a kind of Zizekian formulation. They want to feel good about the situation. So you can have liberal Zionists says, oh, we hate Netanyahu. We're horrified by the Huglan, hooligans, settlers, damaging the West Bank, burning houses, burning cars, killing people. We're horrified by these unruly subjects. What do? Are they willing, in a sense, to sacrifice their privilege, their priority in this world? No, right? So they have this kind of fetishist disavow. I know very well Palestinians are suffering, they're mistreated, our government is inhumane in their treatment of Palestinians, but all the same, I believe Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. I believe in a two-state solution. I believe Palestinians will get their rights. So knowledge of Palestinian suffering is contained, right? It's not being repressed, it's contained. That containment is no longer plausible, right? Either, in a sense, you join Palestinians, you join a kind of anti-colonial struggle, you call for a decolonization of Israel, Palestine, or you become a far right. You're already, in a sense, complicit with the far right. Might as well just be honest about it, right? So I think the liberal Zionist position, especially after October 7th, has disappeared as a valuable intervention. Right. I think the only one that stands now is an anti-colonial left that is universalist in its aspirations.
Absolutely, absolutely. A bit of a longer question. I started the quote from the book in arguing that indigenous Palestinians embody a proletarian position. I propose to recast what Palestinian consciousness of Palestinian indigeneity might look like. The wager for the struggle of collective freedom to become truly transformative and effectively break with liberal colonial scripts and their authorized social relations, Palestinians cannot content themselves with the phantasmatic and nostalgic lure of an atavistic time before the settler. But at the same time, you have another sorry, just that's the end of the code. I add here, at the same time, we have another nostalgia. The liberal response to the Palestinian predicament is to act without acting. We might say that liberals nostalgically yearn for a time before Netanyahu, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
They pathetically plead for the promise of democracy. That was all the quotes from the book.
Mm-hmm.
Here, Zahi, my question is that, I mean, here you're comparing two kinds of nostalgia, two kinds of
Yeah.
empty
Mm-hmm.
nostalgia, identitarian nostalgia, let's call it, yeah, which is bereft of universalism. But my question here is, especially perhaps in the post-October 7 question, don't you think that although both forms of nostalgia are far from a universal politics you're aiming at,
Yeah.
the liberal response is much more dangerous because of the way it can manage the situation and normalize violence
Yeah.
and, let's say, sell security in the
Yeah.
name of peace. Here, I know they might act very closely, but to be honest, I can't buy this argument, especially hearing from Zizek 2 nights ago. In
Yeah.
this new analysis, I can't really buy it that they are two sides of the same coin. I agree that they are really, both of them, they are disarming us of solidarity.
Yeah.
But, and although I am aware of the dangers of ressentiment, but I can't really agree that ressentiment and the violence, the naked violence that is happening, and
Yeah.
they can really work interchangeably. I can't agree that they are equally dangerous.
Yeah.
I think that the nostalgia of Palestinians is less dangerous, especially because of the global capitalism that is
Mhm.
working behind the
Mhm.
Israeli, let's call, nostalgia. Sorry, I hope it was
Yeah. Yeah.
concrete,
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
question. It
Yeah.
was like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, absolutely. The danger and kind of Palestinian nostalgia is to be locked in your rootedness. So this is a kind of Fanonian rejoinder to indigeneity and Fanon's major concerns not to lose yourself in the past, not to find legitimacy for your existence, for your worthiness, for your dignity in the past, right? For a time prior to the Zionist, in a sense, invasion of historic Palestine. But this is more of a kind of never solidarity before criticism. In a sense, it's a part of a kind of engagement, critical engagement with indigenous scholars and how to cast the Palestinian vision. And I agree, right? Culture functions as a mode of resistance. I mean, existing is resistance at some fundamental level, and drawing on your culture as a mode, as a mechanism to shield yourself from erasure is useful. But for me, again, at the Fanonian point, it's not sufficient, right? In the sense that necessity is there, but it can lock you into a certain vision, myopic vision of the future, which is a return back to the past. So this is why I have a kind of critique of decoloniality, which takes this occasion to just de-link from the Western world. And I don't think you can de-link from global capitalism. I think you have to go through global capitalism to change this world. But I completely agree with you. The liberal Zionist position and the liberal position more generally is the problem. And Zizek, made his career criticizing the liberal position. And here I would want to see that more directly applied to the current condition between Palestine and Israel, where you don't call for. So the two-state solution is the liberal paradise, because it allows you to tolerate all the evils of Israel, because at least you have the two-state solution. So for me, right, the courage of hopelessness, to take a formulation dear to Zizek, is to accept a condition of hopelessness now within this horizon. That in a sense, Netanyahu has won. Palestine is, in a sense, completely gone, has been absorbed by a greater Israel. Only then can we imagine something actually new. Can we bring invention into this world? So the liberal position of this vision of an Israel before Netanyahu, or even you can imagine a Netanyahu before Netanyahuism, that somehow could be recovered, is nonsense, right? And since there's a certain constitutive reality in the Zionist formulation of Israel, right? Zionism as an ideology that distorts reality, and and more importantly for me, as a collective fantasy that teaches Jews who to desire, what to desire, what to hate, until that is very much dealt with in terms of decolonization, decolonizing program, as Fanon announced it in The Wretched of the Earth, right? It's an absolute disorder. That's what you need in this current formulation, not appeasement of Netanyahu, but an actual engagement with settler colonialism. I remember years ago, Ben Habib wrote this review of Butler's Parting Ways, and they basically said, if you say Israel is a settler colonial state, you're not going to get anywhere, right? You're not going to move your interlocutor. So basically, nobody likes to be called a racist. That's Ben Habib's message, which I think today is the norm from this center left. But in a sense, let's move beyond settler colonialism. It's reductive, simplistic, and by the way, Israel is not completely a settler state. The Shoah, the history of anti-Semitism doesn't really qualify it as a settler colony. So these are moves to innocence. Jews are victims, hence, right? They produce the most moral army in the world. This is how they describe their IDF, as the most moral army. Because they've suffered. So unless we go back to reality, right, the colonial reality, the colonial situation, something fundamentally will be left out from the analysis. And I don't know if you saw this, shortly after October 7th, there was a open letter sent. It was titled Philosophy for Palestine. And in that letter, there was a kind of pertinent formulation. And what these philosophers were saying who wrote the letter. And I added my name to the letter, full disclosure. This notion of a reckless indifference to history, that you're so quick to judge the situation that you ignore how Hamas is a reaction. Hamas is not an action. It is a reaction to the occupation. It is a response to the brutality of the occupation, of the caging of Palestinians, of the blatant disabuse of people in the West Bank. Until you see Palestinians as reacting, right, you will be missing your hermeneutical intervention will be weak, will be incomplete at best. So that's the reality here that I'm trying to confront, that this kind of recklessness to the reality of Palestinians, the everyday reality of Palestinians. What Zizek says, what happens when nothing happens? Until we take that seriously, this cycle will come back again. Hamas, they'll be eradicated. But you cage Palestinians, you're going to produce symptoms. You've just annihilated, over 32,000 Palestinians. What do you think their family member is going to be thinking about Israel? You've guaranteed rage, right, for Palestinians for generations. This is baked in Israel's decision. If you have, in a sense, a Palestinian fueled by ressentiment, you can pathologize it, you can blame their anti-Semitic mind, but until you actually see what's producing it and change the material conditions that generated this hatred of Israelis, it's not a hatred that is part of a mental disease. It is a hatred that is produced by material conditions. So when Audre Lorde says, right, her anger is a response to anti-Blackness, to racism. It's a response. These emotions, anger, ressentiment, cannot be simply dismissed or condemned from the perspective of politics of respectability. They have to be taken seriously. And my argument in this book is about a ressentiment, a public use of ressentiment, a ressentiment that is dialecticized, that moves beyond a politics of blame that reinforces me, my identity politics, the identity of my group, towards a kind of ressentiment that appeals to other grieved bodies, right? So that's the logic that I actually have taken up in a more recent work on the politics of the wretched, which takes this public use of ressentiment and foregrounds it as a vision of politics that, it's not a question of not being angry, right? Not being a figure of ressentiment. It's how do you move through that emotion? How do you articulate a politics out of it, rather than let's move beyond it, let's suppress it, let's transcend it? No, I think one has to foreground this ressentiment and dialecticize it.
Absolutely fascinating, very interesting, Zahi. Look, I mean, the reason I talked about I compared these two forms of empty nostalgia was that for me, one of them is actually more engaging, more dangerous, and the reason for that was that like this liberal subject is not only politically interesting, superficial, and ridiculous. It's even even as epistemologically, it's very ridiculous. The reason for that is that I'm not that far from the Iranian uprising, and the way I could see the feedback on German media or European media, German media specifically. What is funny, absurd, and ridiculous for me is that why, when it comes to Israel, the liberal German subject, even in one-to-one conversation, tries to convince me that the only evil there is Netanyahu.
Yeah,
And in the absence of Netanyahu, we will have this kind of open liberal Israel. But when it comes to Iran, people want to put sanction and wage a war against Iran. People want to bombard Iran. Why? Like my question is very simple. Why there is this complication when it comes to Israel, but there is this simplicity when it comes to Iran?
sure.
You know,
And in part, there's a great deal of racism, right? In a sense that Israel, in a sense, resembles European powers, right? In the way they look, in the way they think, and this kind of superiority is is embodied in Israeli politics that reflects very nicely, at least if not current Western opinions, historical Western opinions. In a sense, you see Israel behaving as an older colonial power that doesn't care about laws, that imposes its will on the inferior, on brown bodies. So this connection, well, I mean, Germany is unique for different reasons, but I think European powers from Canada, from the United States, from France, they see themselves in Israel. And there's a kind of bizarre jouissance. They wish they could do the same to their own marginalized communities, right? But now they're going too far. They have to pull back. But in a sense, there is a vision that, yeah, this is an unruly, unrestricted sovereignty. When they look at Iran, this is, non-Europeans should not have this force, should not be able to display any kind of sovereignty. So I think there's a deep level of racism involved in this kind of identification with Israel as another settler state. I mean, all the settler states, in a sense, line up behind Israel because they don't want to be next, right? They don't want to be called out for their settler logics. Um, Germany made the Shoah constitutive of its identity, and the Shoah became essentially tied to Israel as a response, right? A Zionist response to the Shoah. So you go against Israel, you go against German identity, its attempt to redeem itself through its support of Israel. So this kind of collective investment, German collective investment in Israel, makes perfect sense for why they're so supportive of Israel. And when they criticize Netanyahu, it's among friends. We had a frank discussions. What do you mean a frank discussion? I mean, it's, you know, how can you have a frank discussion with a war criminal? But
yeah, uh, yeah, I said it's absurd. It's like, and here it's the point that comes. I mean, perhaps I have two questions left, so if you
yeah,
have time,
yeah,
like two
yeah, sure,
questions, and
sure.
uh, so I reserve the better one, which is more interesting for me for later. The question here is that, not the question again, perhaps is a comment.
Yeah,
Um, you talk, I mean, you have devoted one chapter beautifully to paranoia and ressentiment. Which actually, to be honest, it was the reason that brought me to your book. It was after the interview with my friend Short and his book on ressentiment that I came to your book on ressentiment. So, although such ressentiment, I'm quoting you, can only authorize and foster what Said calls an unenviable rhetoric and politics of blame.
yeah,
But for me, but for me myself, the overlap of liberal Zionism and Western liberal left is a kind of arrogance. The
yeah,
arrogance of having reflected every aspect and as a result being bereft of ressentiment and
yeah,
paranoia. Well, reflection, and again, reflection and the ability to reflect is a privilege, which reminds me of what you beautifully depict in the book of Godard's idea, Jean-Luc Godard's
mhm,
idea that the epic was for Israelis and documentary for
yeah,
Palestinians.
yeah,
And more importantly, for me, as the Iranian subject in the end of the day, empty of this paranoia, sometimes I think that, oh, how simplistic it is to live without this ressentiment,
Yeah.
to live without this paranoia. You know, like it has, again, it's no
Yeah.
question. It is just like sharing the perhaps only affective level of something that I
Sure,
found interesting in the book.
sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a kind of privilege of not being paranoid. There's a privilege of not being,
Mm,
taken up by ressentiment. And this privilege is not available for a lot of people, where in a sense their paranoia becomes a survival strategy. You should, if you're Black living in an anti-Black world, you should be paranoid. If you're Palestinian living under occupation, you should be paranoid. If you believe reality, in a sense, is going to treat you fairly, if they're going to respect your rights, if they're going to cultivate a sphere of engagement and collectivity and sociality, you make yourself vulnerable to pain and potentially death. So paranoia here is a survival strategy. It's not a mental disorder completely, right? And if it is a disorder, it has to be linked back to the material conditions that breeds this reality. And the ressentiment, right, that you quoted in my connection of this ressentiment to Said's warning against this kind of politics of blame, which is corrosive and self-destructive in a very ungenerative fashion, is set in contrast to the public use of ressentiment, which does not follow the politics of blame. And this public use of ressentiment, I think, has legs to elevate ressentiment from a Nietzschean orbit, from a slavish, reactionary, spiteful being.
Interesting, very interesting. Last question is that in a part of the book, towards the end of the book, you talk about a filmmaker, Elia Soleiman,
Yeah,
and the making of a comedy about the daily repression and humiliation that Israel checkpoints represent. The question is that, um, which is actually very much my interest still. Do you think confronting or facing all this absurdity, humor can play a role? I mean, I know perhaps it is like in it's too early to talk about humor. Like we are still in the tragic part of the whole
yeah,
scenario. But
yeah,
Suleiman's humor, as you say, does not simply negate the ressentiment of his Palestinian characters. They are still spiteful beings, but
yeah,
their spitefulness takes on additional meanings when they are seen as exaggerated, transformed into a comical stage. In other words, the ludic counterbalances the force of pathos, short-circuiting the emergence of compassion at the sight of the abject. End of quote. Although in our compass of mourning is still very early to think of humor in Palestinian subject, but how do you, Zahi, see humor next to ressentiment, at least as a mechanism which perhaps diminishes this reactive force there?
sure. So the strong pull of pathos with ressentiment is significant. And, there is a way in which the private use of ressentiment somehow can bring back a more polished, more measured ressentiment that any public use of ressentiment could fall into. So in a sense, the rawness of the private use of ressentiment still has a force, right? And that force is very well articulated in a concept of pathos. I think humor here is an attempt to short circuit how we imagine Palestinians, breaking from, right, the abject Palestinian, imagining a Palestinian who makes fun of their abject condition. And Zizek makes this reference how Jews in Auschwitz would come up with jokes talking about their own condition. So humor here is, a mode of refusal, a refusal to have your reality completely eradicated, right? it is still a moment of resistance to a gaze that wants to obliterate you. So it complicates the vision of the documentary, right? That reifies the Palestinian as it seeks to tell the Palestinian story. And I think documentaries are not a priori reductive, identitarian, but there is a certain kind of horizon that imposes itself. Can you short circuit a documentary from within? Of course you can, right? But at least the documentary brings in a certain vision of the Palestinian that humor, where humor tends to be evacuated. So in this film, by foregrounding humor, how do you respond to the first scene, right? You have children chasing Santa Claus, stabbing Santa Claus. What a great opening, right? To think about the Palestinian attitude towards its reality. It's the world turned upside down, right? Le monde à l'envers that I described in the book. This is the best way to understand what is happening in Palestinians. It's not, what Saidiya Hartman warns about, empathy. Nobody's going to have empathy with the children there, but in a sense, they're able to recognize certain rage against Santa Claus, who promises things. That's what Santa Claus does. Promises, gives you a gift, and the world has abandoned Palestinians, and this becomes a visualization, which has a lot of humor in it, of that betrayal. So it's a great gift to be able to introduce humor in these very tragic and devastating scenes.
Absolutely. Zahi, thank you very much for this nice and generous exchange. I really learned a lot from the book, and no less from this conversation that I had with you.